If you've been convicted of a fraud crime in federal court, or a loved one has been convicted of a fraud crime in federal court, one of the big things that the judge will look at are the sentencing guidelines. And so I'd like to explain a little bit about how the sentencing guidelines work for fraud cases in particular. First, these sentencing guidelines for fraud are really getting quite crazy. After Enron, many people in the government were concerned that people who committed white-collar crimes were getting off easy. And so as a result, they really ratcheted up the law as it relates to fraud and the amounts of time people spend in prison if they're convicted of a white-collar crime or a fraud crime. So as a result now, you can see a guidelines calculation in a fraud crime that could be as high as, it could call for a sentence that's as high as the sentence called for a kidnapping or an arson. It's really a remarkable example of how this part of the federal sentencing world has lost perspective. Fortunately, some judges are recognizing that. Unfortunately, some judges aren't. Your guidelines calculation in a fraud case will be determined by a couple of things. First, the loss amount will be very important. If the loss amount is more than $1 million, then for a run-of-the-mill fraud case, that's going to call for a sentence of more than 3 years almost every time. Loss is very important. And for fraud guidelines purposes, loss is not the amount of money you made or the amount of money the other people lost. It's the amount of money that someone in that situation could have seen the victims losing. It's a reasonably foreseeable loss is the language of the guidelines, and it can get quite far away from any amount that anyone made. The next thing that the guidelines look at are a number of characteristics about the crime. If there were a lot of victims, if you were in a position of trust that you abused in order to make the fraud work, those things can enhance the sentence that the sentencing guidelines call for the fraud guidelines.